Well, I'd like to welcome all the participants that joined us today. Thank you so much for signing on. My name is Jim Wardlaw. I'm the Executive Director of the Buffalo Center for Cultural Innovation. As you may or may not know, each year the Buffalo Center for Cultural Innovation hosts an event called Awaken. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we had to cancel Awaken this year, but I'm very excited to bring a couple of our presenters to this webinar today. James Forr with Olson Zaltman & Associates, and Dr. Djordjija Petkoski, if I think I have that right, thank you.
Perfect.
A lecturer at Wharton, a professor at Wharton. They are going to bring some of the content from the Awaken event to today's webinar, and hopefully deepen and broaden your understanding of some of the deep psychological motivations and effects that show up in a lot of our organizations today. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce James Forr and Dr. Djordjija Petkoski, and I'll look forward to hearing what they have to say. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Jim, and thanks to the Buffalo Center for Cultural Innovation, not only for sponsoring the Awaken conference this spring, but then for following up on that and inviting us to this webinar today. We really appreciate the opportunity. What we will be doing today is talking about some research that we conducted into the minds of sustainable innovators, both entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs. We'll talk about the mental models that those people have, the experiences that they're having, how they react emotionally along that innovation journey, and then what that means for you and your sustainability efforts. Before we get into the research, however, I'd like to turn it over to Djordjija to talk a little bit more about what we mean by sustainability and to set the scene for what we're going to discuss as we get into this research. Djordjija?
Well, again, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to interacting with those who are part of this conversation. Definitely, we live in a very unusual time, whether we call that new normal, new reality, or maybe even more appropriately, the new world. Is really changing all aspects of business. What is fundamentally new, I will say, is from one side, we have a very clear direct and indirect impact on what business is doing. Public perception is in the fundamental flow, capturing all important things from climate change to health, gender issue, race, consumption pattern, good governance, transparency and accountability, and so on. So it's a very dynamic thing, extremely complex. And then the question is how we can make sense of that. What is appropriate framework that will guide more structural thinking about these issues? So our research showed that probably sustainability is sufficiently broader and well-structured concept that can help us addressing these issues. And of course, a logical way is to start reimagining the core business of what we are really doing. What is new, I would say, is first, it's not enough to reimagine your business. You have to really think also in context, are you part of the exchange process? Are you part of shaping that external environment, or you will be passively waiting for somebody to take care of that, and then you will reimagine your business? So the first challenge is really going beyond just reimagining your core business, but also becoming part, to the extent possible, of course, in shaping the new reality. The other thing is that sustainability been around for decades, and kind of we get used of playing the game, putting too much emphasis of going green, and printing a nice annual report and campaign. But I think now we have to really revisit all of that, because the expectations are fundamentally different from what business is expecting to do under these circumstances. And I think thinking in context of authenticity, is that really what we are doing, or is just the window washing, is a fundamental thing, not only in terms of expectations from the public, but also internally. You cannot change the culture inside the company and support innovation if you are not authentic of what you are trying to do. Which of course bring us to the core of our research, the critical need to get much deeper insights in what is going on, both inside the company and also with people with public perception, being consumers or being just the public expecting something for us, or something more concrete would be investors. Are they ready to invest in our company if it's not authentic and addressing these issues? One very interesting element, if the world has been changing so fast, if we need to have innovative ideas, I think what we have neglected big time so far, at least, is the role of young people. And we can notice that in the last few years, and particularly in the last few months, young people are becoming very active in shaping the external environment, which means that the expectations of these people has to be properly managed. And just to answer with the last comment is basically, if we are thinking in terms of what kind of corporate culture we need to strengthen and support innovative innovations, we have to keep in mind that many of these innovative ideas will come from young employees, and understanding their mindset and the way how they see the reality around them and the culture inside the company is of critical importance. So that's few introductory comments from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Djordjija. So let's take a look at these innovators that we studied. As we go through this research, what you will see is that the story that they tell themselves about themselves is this story that we call the hero's journey. It sounds very arrogant when you put it that way, but it's not necessarily. We probably all think of ourselves in our lives as heroes in some way, shape, or form. The hero's journey is a metaphorical storytelling pattern, and it's prominent, especially in Western cultures, in myth, in cinema, and in other forms of storytelling. And the hero's journey consists of 3 acts, which we will discuss: the departure, the initiation, and the return. And this is a pattern that many of us, perhaps all of us, rely upon in one way, shape, or form to think about various aspects of our lives. It's highly unconscious. So if you go and ask people, are you on a hero's journey? They'll look at you very strangely, probably. But nevertheless, that is the emotional framework that we use when thinking about ourselves. And it's the emotional framework that these innovators use when thinking about their innovation process and the experiences that they're going through. These 3 steps are a little easier to illustrate than they are to explain necessarily. So there are various steps in the hero's journey. First, there is the departure. And the departure is the moment before everything starts to happen. If you know about Harry Potter, things start out very bleakly for him. He's living in the cupboard under the stairs. He doesn't think he can be a real wizard. But then finally, something happens that gives you permission to embark upon that journey. So he goes off to purchase his school equipment, and then the initiation begins. And the initiation is essentially the journey where Harry goes out, or whoever the hero is in whatever story, goes out and slays the dragons and conquers the monsters and does all kinds of good things. So in Harry Potter's world, he learns of his parents' death. He goes to Hogwarts and gets adjusted there. Eventually, he reaches the Philosopher's Stone. And then finally, in any hero's journey, there is a return to the normal world, where for Harry, he returns to Privet Drive, but he returns changed, and he returns in some ways to a changed world. And the hero takes what he or she learns along this journey and uses it to adapt that world. This is a metaphorical pattern we see all over the place. You see it in Star Wars, you see it in Harry Potter, you see it in Lord of the Rings, you see it in any well-written biography as far as that goes. And we saw it very clearly in our research. The tool that we used to uncover the unconscious thinking of these innovators is called ZMET, which stands for the Zaltman Metaphor Elicitation Technique. These are one-on-one interviews, and unlike focus groups, it's really like a session on a psychologist's couch where you can get people to open up about very deeply personal feelings that they otherwise might struggle to elaborate upon or to put into words, or deeply personal feelings that they might not even be aware of. The process involves us asking them to collect images, pictures that represent their thoughts and feelings about whatever it is that we're studying. And those pictures serve as a jumping off point into this much deeper and richer discussion. We then go off and read the transcripts of these interviews and look for the metaphorical patterns that emerge throughout the interview, because if you can understand the metaphors that people use unconsciously when thinking about whatever it is that you're studying, you can learn a tremendous amount about how they feel about that topic at a deep level. And the insights that we gathered really will provide you, we hope, with some of the insights you need to begin to engage your employees in a more productive way when thinking about sustainable innovation. So it is through ZMET that the hero's journey was revealed. Let's specifically look at who we spoke to. We spoke to 20 innovators, and we're using the term innovators as a catch-all term that covers both intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs who we interviewed were members of the 3 winning teams in the Ideas for Action competition, which was sponsored by the Wharton School and the World Bank Group. And they were young entrepreneurs. The 3 winning teams were Team Deliver, which is based in Nigeria. They were coming up with a local approach to connecting senders with local transporters and trying to overcome some of the problems with inefficient postal infrastructure that is a trouble in developing nations. There was Team Oinks from Uruguay, OINCS. That team created a mobile platform that let the community, local community, monitor traffic and security problems in real time. And then finally, Team Knock Research, which developed a platform that was designed to increase the transparency of the slum labor market in Mumbai. We then supplemented those interviews with intrapreneurs. These were executives in large national and multinational organizations who were responsible for sustainability within those organizations. Each of these groups had a slightly different picture gathering assignment, what we call the ZMET question. The entrepreneurs were asked to collect images that represent their thoughts and feelings about helping the United Nations achieve its sustainable development goals. And the intrapreneurs were asked to find pictures that represented their thoughts and feelings about the climate for sustainable innovation inside your organization. So taking 2 slightly different angles in looking at a common problem. So let's take a look at the insights. All the images and all the quotes that you see throughout this deck will be coming directly from those people who we interviewed. As we go through this, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to raise at the end, feel free to enter those in the chat box and we'll address those near the end of our presentation. So as we looked at our images that we got from respondents, we saw all kinds of images like these. People moving from place to place, direction signs, journeys, as it were. And this served as the impetus for us to start thinking about this innovator experience through the lens of the hero's journey. It's not so much actually how we started to think about it, but it was the thing that let us see that that's how they think about it. And we reflected that in our report. So we talked about the 3 stages in the hero's journey. Let's take this step by step and walk you through these innovators' experiences at each stage of the hero's journey. Intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs are very similar in the experiences that they have. There are some differences, obviously, and we'll highlight those, but at a broad level, that experience of the intrapreneur and the entrepreneur is quite similar. So we'll start with the departure. One key issue on the departure, or one key way of thinking about the departure that almost everybody described, was that these folks see themselves as humble heroes. When you hear that term hero's journey, it sounds very grandiose, but that's not exactly how they're thinking about themselves. This was one of our intrapreneurs who brought in a picture of a masked wrestler. And the key part of this image was really the mask. He described himself as an anonymous superhero. You're not visible, but you're helping with a greater good, helping the world to be a better place. And this idea came up repeatedly, the notion that I'm just one person here, and at one level, my individual efforts maybe don't amount to much, but my efforts plus someone else's, plus someone else's, plus someone else's added together, then you've got something. So there's something heroic in that struggle. As we discussed with the hero's journey, the heroes always need to hear a call. They need to get inspired from somewhere. This was one of our entrepreneurs. He talked about an experience that he had. He was an executive. He was an older gentleman. And he brought in this picture that you see of somebody going a different way, taking a different route. And he described himself as like Moses leading the people to Israel. You have to take risks. And he talked about the point in his life where he came to this realization. He said he's in his 50s. He got to a point where he said to himself, I basically have enough money. He was based in Europe. And he said, my kids mean a lot to me, and I'm separated from them. So they commute back and forth. And he said, at some point, I said to myself, this job has to be worth it for more than money. There has to be something bigger at play. That was his call. And that's what's continuing to motivate him. As it says, it gives him strength to continue. But as you know from movies and books and biographies and all those things, just because you hear the call does not necessarily mean that you will embark on the journey. We heard a lot of this about resistance of the call, or resistance to the call. And that's really an important part of the journey. Most people are not necessarily eager to jump headlong into a journey that's full of risk. Some people are, but there's a lot of hesitancy too. One of our entrepreneurs talked about his experience talking to people about that journey. And he said, one of the things I always ask people is, do you believe this is going to happen? Do you believe this idea that you're planning is actually going to come true? And as he says, that's where you get them. They start to second guess themselves and say, oh, I don't know. And he said, that's the difference between where they are and where I am. He said, if you dig really down, really deep with them, they don't believe it can happen. And as he says, for me, at this point, the only reason I'm in it is because I think it's possible. So it's critical for those innovators on that hero's journey to get by that resistance that they naturally will have at the beginning. Once they do that, the meat of the journey begins, which is known as the initiation. And here's where the intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs divide a little bit. They think about themselves a little bit differently. Now, in movies, we see all kinds of heroes' journeys. You see it in all sorts of movies, and all sorts of books, and all sorts of plays, and really any form of communication that tells a story. But they're all different in certain ways. People think about themselves differently as they're on this journey. For entrepreneurs, they think about themselves as innocents. Intrapreneurs, on the other hand, those people who are working inside large legacy organizations, tend to think about themselves more as rebels. And this reveals two different emotional mindsets for thinking about sustainable innovation. It also suggests two different sets of needs that those folks have. So let's dive into that a little bit. What is it like to cross the threshold if you're an innocent, an entrepreneur, versus if you are a rebel, an intrapreneur? It's quite different. So entrepreneurs are, you might say, a little bit naive about it, or maybe a little bit hopeful, depending on whether you look at the glass half full or half empty, but they are optimistic and confident. One member of Team Oinks said, it's like getting married. And he brought in this image of a wedding. And he said, it's like when I got married, it was new, it was exciting. You don't really know what you're going to get into. It may not end well, but you do it out of faith nevertheless. You don't necessarily have control over what's going to happen, but you're crossing your fingers and you have really big expectations. On the other hand, the intrapreneurs think about it quite differently. That naivete, you might say, is not there. Their idea is that as I'm crossing this threshold, I'm courageous, but I'm wary. This was an intrapreneur who brought this image of the Golden Gate Bridge leading into a bank of fog. And he said, you have to be willing to go into the unknown. You have to have some guts because your credibility is on the line. And in a large organization such as this, that's pretty much all you have. That is your badge of professional honor, as he put it. And you don't want to squander that easily because, as they said, if you're not credible, you just become some Yahoo. So it's difficult and it's scary. So the scary part is unique to the intrapreneur, or is similar across intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs. But where they're different is the intrapreneurs have, in some ways, a lot more at stake, or they believe that they do. So how do they feel along this journey? Again, it's a little bit different emotionally. For the entrepreneur innocence, there is quite often a feeling of aloneness. This person brought in an image of a tired hurdler, and he said, this is, or she said, this is how I feel. I feel like a tired runner. The only thing that keeps you going is that hope of what could be. People around you are skeptical. This was a young person, and she talked about how when she went back home, all her friends and her family members would say, you know, why don't you get a real job like everybody else? What are you doing? They don't necessarily understand what you're talking about. So as she says, it takes a lot, and it's hard to stay motivated. There is fear as well. One person compared the entrepreneurial journey to like walking in fog, because with sustainability, especially in a developing part of the world, you don't know what the government's going to do tomorrow. Where's our funding going to come from? How are we going to do marketing? It all gets kind of terrifying. There are also feelings of inadequacy. This person was part of the team in Nigeria, and she described she went to school in the US, and then she went back home to Nigeria. And that's when it kind of hit her where, you know, I don't feel like I'm making progress. She said, I was in the US with visions that I could change the whole world, but now that I'm back home, I beat myself up a lot for not getting to where I want to go. Sometimes I feel like I made a mistake because it just feels like people here at home are not ready for this kind of innovation. And then finally, there is some cynicism. So we ask people, the entrepreneurs, about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And there is a little bit of skepticism because, especially in developing nations, these folks have heard it all before, lots of promises that never came to fruition. So as this young man said, I hope my voice has an impact, but a lot of time that talk doesn't necessarily translate into impact. So the UN might have its heart in the right place, the government might have its heart in the right place. That doesn't necessarily mean anything is going to happen. So for the entrepreneurs, it's feeling alone, feeling scared, feeling inadequate, and feeling cynical. A little bit of a different story for the intrapreneur rebels. Again, they're working inside large organizations, and many times they feel disrespected. This was a participant we talked to who worked in Serbia. Management for his company was located elsewhere in Europe, and he said, and he was looked upon, or his division in Serbia was looked upon as an innovator in the sustainable innovation space. But on one hand, that got them some respect. On another hand, it got them some disrespect. He said, we're looked at as the crazy Serbians. And he compared himself to these flowers, or compared his division to these flowers, where we're trying to blossom in the shadow of this windmill, which represents management. And he says he has to be careful because he doesn't want to be too visible with some of his outside the box ideas, because if he is, management could look askance at that and they could cut down everything. Entrepreneurs also feel limited. In this image, the person said the sky represents freedom, and she's down here inside this sort of container that only lets her view a sliver of the sky. And as she says, the sky's freedom, but we only have a little bit of it. It's like when a kid does something good and you ignore it, but then he breaks a glass and you punish him. So there's not a whole lot of margin for error inside organizations when you're doing something non-traditional like sustainable innovation. And as a result, there is a natural gravitational pull back toward the status quo that she has to fight. We also, as entrepreneurs, feel misunderstood because no one knows what we're talking about. Dr. Petkoski at the beginning of the presentation tried to give a broad definition of sustainability. However, I think it's common for most people to think about sustainability just as environment, and that's not all of what it is. And as this person says, maybe we need to drop the word sustainability because nobody gets it. You need to have a new narrative, new glasses that help people see this role for sustainability inside the organization, to see that role through a different lens. And finally, a sense of vulnerability. This was an image someone brought of an unclothed woman climbing up a rock. And the participant said this person appears to feel unprotected, and she said, that's how I feel. She was in a division that's small inside an organization. People above her, around her, don't really understand what they're trying to do. The people working with her are burned out because there's not a lot of guidance from above in the organization. And as she says, my back is going to break soon. I really need a plan from this company for how to go forward. Without that, it's just chaotic, and that makes me feel vulnerable. So disrespect, limitations, misunderstandings, vulnerability, endemic to the entrepreneur rebel mindset along this journey. So with these problems, with these concerns, with this emotional turmoil, as it were, people need things to help them along the journey. So for the entrepreneur innocent, what they really need is wisdom and support. Now, this wisdom and support can come from different places. It can come from outsiders. It can come from sages and guides. As one of our participants said here, the project that we're working on, it's like raising a child. And you get into raising a child, you really don't know what you're doing. And if you're a young parent, you might bring in your parents to help guide you, or you might read a book. But if you're on this entrepreneurial journey, you might need a mentor, sort of a grandfather, grandmother type of person. You might want to partner with an external organization so that we know what to expect, that we can overcome some of those fears, that we can deal with some of those potholes in the road that could come from government or anything else in the outside environment. And as we're working in teams, as these entrepreneurs are, we get support from our colleagues. This image was a person looking out over a large landscape. And as she says, the person here is very small, which symbolizes the fact that on our own as individuals, there's only so much we can do. But as a team, we can do a whole lot more. We all have strengths and weaknesses. There are people on my team who have development skills. There are other people on my team who have strategy skills. I have my own skills. We bring those things together, and we're much more of a force together than we are on our own. So the entrepreneurs need that support and wisdom. On the other hand, what the intrapreneurs value, as opposed to the entrepreneurs, what the intrapreneurs value really is freedom. And this manifested itself through all these images that people brought to us, symbolizing the need for freedom. And that freedom can come in different ways. Freedom, ironically, can come through structure. We saw that quote earlier from the entrepreneur who was so frustrated by the lack of guidance and lack of support she was getting from above. But that sort of support, that kind of structure can provide freedom. As this person says, in the sustainability field, a lot of times people are just wandering through the desert, but that doesn't get you anywhere. And as he says, part of my constraint is that I need to do something that at the heart of the brand generates revenue and makes customers happy. And he said that sort of guidance that he has takes him down a certain path. If you don't have that, then you're just kind of asking why you're doing this. And as he says, to really figure out why someone is doing this, doing something, doing anything, you need to ask why 7 times. Without this kind of structure, you get to about the second why and you really run out. And without that, those sort of sustainable innovations cannot succeed inside an organization. Related to that is the notion that we get freedom by proving our business case. In tough times like this, if you're seen as just a bolt-on or a nice to have, you're going to get cut pretty quickly. So we need to prove why sustainability is not just something cool that we should do, but we need to prove why it affects the bottom line. Otherwise, and make that the heart of your business. As this person said, just like you can't rip the heart out of a person and say, here it is, and expect the person to get up off the table and keep walking, you shouldn't be able to do that with sustainability either. Sustainability should be at the center of what you're doing. And then freedom can also be obtained through small victories. Basically, there's a lot of skepticism internally about sustainability from the entrepreneurs who we met. You have to sort of prove yourself in small steps to gain that credibility. And when you can gain that credibility, you get freedom. This was a story about getting people, a simple thing, to turn off their computer monitors overnight when they leave the office. And they did a little study that showed how much energy you can save by shutting off your monitors. calculated that you need to plant a tree and take care of that tree for 15 years to absorb all the carbon pollution that's emitted just by leaving your monitors on overnight. And that set an example, and that little thing started to inspire people. And as she says, you start to inspire people, you start to recognize people, you start making those people heroes for the things that they do, then your sustainable innovations pick up momentum. And then finally, the return. So what's the goal of all of this? There are all these challenges on the journey, all these trials and tribulations. What does it lead to? So why do people stick with it? They stick with it because they have some sort of vision of where it's going to lead. So whether you're an intrapreneur or whether you're an entrepreneur, those goals, that return, means empowerment for the disempowered. This was one of our entrepreneurs on Team Deliver who talked about their sustainable initiative as being like a ladder that would pull people up the stairways of a pyramid. Right now, people in developing nations don't have the luxury of thinking about broader goals, but through this, we can take care of those basic needs, like in this case, figuring out a way to get deliveries from point A to point B, and then they can start thinking more broadly about what they're trying to achieve in the world. Also, when all is said and done, the result will be to inspire others. People realize they're being watched, and they realize that they in this generation are pioneers, the first in our roles, whether they're entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs. So as this person said, that gives us a lot of motivation to do more, to share excitement with the rest of my company, and that's really what drives me to get out of bed in the morning. These were interviews all over the world, many in developing parts of the world, and there was a lot of pride in advancing my region. This was a representation of the statue of the thinker, obviously. And she was talking about the foundation that she's a part of, her business is a foundation where there's a mentorship program. And that's part of sustainability. And it's fighting the brain drain in our country. And that, from her perspective, is making this a better country, a better part of the world, because without that, there's really no future for our region. So we're not only improving our region, but also improving the world. As this person said, I'm a link in a chain. I wake up every morning thinking about what I can do to make the world a little bit better place. And through my efforts, combined with the efforts of others, back to that notion of the humble hero, we can all make the world a better place. And finally, there's really no telling where the journey ends. This was an image that someone brought of a person floating out into space. And as he described, he was an entrepreneur. He said that we have a platform that could potentially create a developmental spiral and have an exponential effect on society and create exponential momentum for change. So again, the sense that you have one domino that you flick over and it can lead to more and more and more. And we're in such a relatively new space when thinking about sustainable innovation that the possibilities seem almost endless. So in summary, the hero's journey, the journey of the sustainability innovator, whether you're an intrapreneur, whether you're an entrepreneur, there is a first act, which is the departure. These folks think about themselves as humble heroes who have overcome resistance to the call and have embarked on a journey. Act 2 is the initiation, where the journey really gets going. For the entrepreneurs who feel like innocents, it starts with a feeling of optimism and confidence. Quickly, as they run into things that those rose-colored glasses get smudged a bit and they start feeling alone, scared, inadequate, and cynical, but that's overcome through wisdom that they get from more experienced sages and guides and also from colleagues. The intrapreneur is a rebel. They're going into this with eyes wide open, so they're feeling wary, but nevertheless courageous as they embark on the journey. They're dealing with all sorts of external resistance, disrespect, limitations, misunderstandings, vulnerabilities from inside their organization. So what they really need to overcome that is freedom, which they can get through structure, through good guidance from others in the organization, but also improving their own successes and getting that momentum going. And then finally, Act 3 is the return, the ultimate conclusion of this journey, which is empowering the disempowered, serving as an inspiration for others, advancing our region and our world. And there are also unknown unknowns. The possibilities are endless once we start down that sustainable innovation path. So with all this in mind, what does this mean for you? it's one way to start thinking about it is your organization ready to fully support sustainable innovation in this, what will soon be a post-COVID-19 world? And for those of you who are engaged with the Buffalo Center for Cultural Innovation, you probably know a little bit about the 9 dimensions of creativity, innovation, and change within an organization: challenge, freedom, trust, conflict, playfulness, humor, idea time, idea support, debate, and risk-taking. These are 9 areas that you can think about, and or you can assess quantitatively. Where does your organization stack up along these dimensions? Are you giving people the kind of culture that is ripe for sustainable innovation, to giving people the sort of freedom that they need to innovate in this kind of way? These are the elements that are really core to that kind of culture. And then another thing to think about is who you really need to understand within your organization to shape that internal climate and culture accordingly. And there are a number of people who are worth understanding. Of course, you can go on your own gut, but quite often your own gut is going to be wrong. A lot of these things that are shaping climate and culture are unconscious. So you really need a way of doing research that's going to dig into that and to understand what those barriers are internally within your organization, and also to understand what the things are in your organization that are really working well and how to possibly enhance those. So it's important to understand managers. What are their beliefs and biases, unspoken, maybe unknown, that are helping to shape the climate and culture of that organization for ill or for good? Customers and or consumers are important too. So when they think about sustainability, what are their unspoken needs? You can ask them directly, but the response to a direct question is usually a surface level answer. It's more productive to try to get below that surface and understand really what are they looking for from an organization when it comes to sustainable practices. External partners, we heard a lot about this in our research, especially with intrapreneurs. How can they get their partners externally to get on board and to innovate and to attend to these very important sustainability issues? For intrapreneurs, also an external partner could be an entrepreneur, or vice versa. An entrepreneur can look to partner with an intrapreneur to get that sort of wisdom. So what is that common ground that can bring those two together? Shareholders and investors, of course, are extremely important. And here it's important to bridge that gap from thinking about sustainability as just something that's a really cool, neat add-on that looks good in an annual report, to really proving to them that sustainability can drive the bottom line. And then finally, employees. What are their perceptions of the organizational culture? We heard from a number of intrapreneurs who talked about the challenges that they face. What sort of challenges are those folks facing in an organization like yours? You can ask them directly. They may have a hard time articulating it. Really important to get below the surface and understand at an unconscious, unspoken level what is happening within your organization that is either driving or inhibiting these sustainable innovation practices. Djordjija, do you have anything to add before we transition into some Q&A?
Not really anything particularly specific. Maybe it's better to give more time for those who are following our conversation so that we can be more focused in commenting this.
Okay, excellent. Alex or Jim, I'll let one of the two of you moderate the Q&A session and curate some of those questions. If you don't mind, I have one that someone sent to us in advance, and maybe we can kick off the conversation that way, Jim, if that sounds okay to you, or Alex.
That'll be great.
Okay. The first question was, how does sustainable innovation fit within disruptive innovation? The way I think about that is sustainable innovation is almost by definition a form of disruptive innovation. Djordjija, what's your thinking about that question?
I mean, first we also need some kind of clarity how we individually define disruptive innovation. If we go at the core, when this concept was introduced, basically disruptive innovation refer to smaller companies with very fewer resources who were challenging already established businesses. So if we take that framework, then we are coming kind of that intersection between entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship, because they have to have that entrepreneurial thinking, but at the same time, being part or attacking a bigger organization. You really have to figure out how the bigger organization will react on your engagement, how they will trigger the innovation process to protect what they are doing. But I think that the beauty of the research is that is really kind of generic enough and create sufficient space that if you would like now to contextualize this funding in very specific context of what you are trying to do, you have that space for adjusting or getting critical insights of how to deal with these issues. And all elements of understanding the consumers, understanding the investors, and so on, are part of that exercise, particularly because disruptive innovations are usually focusing on overlooked segments. So somebody overlooked them, didn't properly understand the potential consumers, or low-end markets where you have to do things in a different way to offer good enough products, but not at the quality of the established players. So in conclusion, it's there. And as usually, the challenge of those leading organizations is to create that space that the sustainability innovators can deal and connect what the funding of this research are and the actual challenges they are facing or trying to address.
Djordjija, how do you think COVID will change the face of sustainable innovation?
What is important of thinking about these issues is, from one side, we have to understand this is a fundamental change. It's not piece here or piece there. I mean, more or less, everything is changing. Adding to that complexity that each individual is one or another way affected in a different way. It's not a traditional way of change. Now, how you balance these very, the needs of understanding the change at the individual's level with what you would like to achieve at the level of an organization, I think it's a new aspect that COVID brings. And another big challenge there is that you have to act immediately. It's not, I will wait until the things stabilize. You have it to do now. So that level of urgency, and as you know, whenever you have to deal in an urgent things, the opportunity for mismanaging the process are huge. So I think the value of the research is also in the fact that I think we managed to capture these very, very fundamental things entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs are emotionally associated with, so that we can provide some ease in moving fast, but making sure that you're not going in a very wrong direction.
Alex, I think there was a question that someone had submitted.
Yeah, we have a couple. So first off, which of the two groups, intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs, do you feel is better positioned to generate lasting changes in sustainability?
That's an interesting question. And I'm not sure there is a correct answer to that question. We've talked about, Djordjija, that a lot of times as time progresses, the intrapreneurs become more like entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurs become more like intrapreneurs. So it's almost like those two folks, in some ways, the entrepreneurs are often in a better position to come up with completely groundbreaking ideas. But on the other hand, they often need the support of intrapreneurs to really bring those to scale and into practice. Do you agree?
Absolutely, and I look at the beauty of the complexity of the COVID impact is that we need a change all over the whole ecosystem. So there are a very special role in sustained change brought by entrepreneurs, and also a very special role of sustained change brought in by entrepreneurs. So both players are playing a very important role. The key is really to understand in which area, which of these two groups have the higher chance of success and impact. And as James said, you cannot look at them as a kind of two separate initiatives. Down the road, there will be an overlapping in a sense that there are some very, very important problems that can only be properly addressed if both sides work together. And the first thing which comes to my mind is really in sophisticated supply chains, particularly if part of the supply chain comes from smaller enterprises. So a mutual understanding what the smaller guys can do to support what the bigger guys with much bigger resources can do is where I would argue that the joint effort among or between entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs will have the highest impact.
Alex, any other questions that have been submitted?
Yes, related to business case, is sustainability pandemic proof, or is it set aside as nice to have? Or even a challenge to things like green friendly cleaning as consumers seek harsher solutions? Or companies struggling with HR solutions about online schooling versus gender equity, although those are likely related as more women pick up kids at home responsibilities?
So the sort of first question was just to reset the.
Yeah. Is sustainability pandemic proof, or is it decided as nice to have?
Okay, well, hopefully, right, Djordjija, it would be pandemic proof, and that's if it's just a nice to have, it's you're in a risky spot, especially if you're internal to an organization. It almost has to be pandemic proof. Would you agree?
I will rephrase the meaning of pandemic proof. I would say, does sustainability help us not only to understand the challenges of the pandemic, but also to understand the opportunities which are created? You are not addressing a big change, you know, COVID, just focusing on the challenges which come, but also through opportunities, so that you move the whole mindset from protecting yourself, which is COVID proof, to moving in direction where you create more value because you recognize the opportunities. So maybe reframing the question makes it easier to find a better way how you can utilize the a broader sustainability concept with the funding of the research to help you in that journey.
So it's sort of like taking a negative and spinning it into a positive. Like the question said something about education, Djordjija. I could see the possibility that this could change the way education is delivered in developing nations, because it forces everyone around the world to rethink how education is delivered. And from that, there can be some breakthrough ideas.
I mean, this is where we are. I mean, my class started the beginning of September, and it's not just the COVID. It's not just the fact that there will be online delivery of knowledge. It's also revisiting what was the core of our teaching before COVID and when we had in-class lectures. So that's the kind of opportunity I'm talking about, that you are not only looking at the way how we deliver the teaching, the education, but really revisiting, are we doing kind of the core things which are relevant for the students? And that's reinforce something which there have been a lot of complaints that many of the graduates, I'm not talking just to my school, I'm talking in general, have not been properly prepared to more quickly utilize the knowledge they take from schools in solving real life problems. And the pandemic is just reminding us that we have to really also think to what extent the knowledge we share is the knowledge that future entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs will have to have.
Alex, I have a question on deck that was sent to me, but I'll see if you have any others that were submitted in real time here.
Yes, I have a couple.
Okay.
One, is there a piece of hero's journey pop culture that you feel is particularly relevant for those of us working in the sustainability field?
Yes, I would say. First of all, I'll say hero's journey manifests itself in pop culture in different ways, but it's not in and of itself a pop culture concept. It's more of a something that's internal in all of us, at least in the Western world, in terms of how we think about their lives. From my perspective, the aspect of that journey that seems where people seem the most vulnerable is in that initiation stage when things start to go wrong, which they inevitably will on any kind of sustainable innovation journey. So you have the entrepreneurs who are really dealing with skepticism and almost disrespect, lack of understanding sometimes from inside their organizations. How to give those people the kind of support they need is a critical question that needs to be answered inside any organization. And that requires taking a real audit, requires managers taking a close audit and of their culture, and also thinking deeply about how their own biases and prejudices may be affecting that culture. Similarly, on the entrepreneurial side, a lot of things can go wrong. So there may be a role for a large organization to help be that mentor, that guide, that quote unquote grandparent that can deliver knowledge and help get those entrepreneurs on the right track and overcoming that sort of feeling of helplessness and fear that can overwhelm them. That's my perspective on it. Djordjija?
Well, I think it's very important to reemphasize what you said about the difference between the metaphor of hero journey and hero entrepreneur or hero innovators. Because sometimes if you don't understand that fundamental difference, then we will end up in the trap where we are only talking about a few guys who made tremendous big change. And a lot of things which require change, which are not on the radar screen of these big hero entrepreneurs, is neglecting and discouraging people. So I think that the way how you, James, explained this is very important. Hero is not just looking at yourself as an individual who will change the world, but looking at self as an individual who get engaged and also motivate, support others to join, or motivate to also start their own journey. So the results of these thousands of anonymous or whatever heroes at the end of the day will definitely produce more sustained innovations and more sustained change. And this is where we have to really put more emphasis in talking about the hero part of the story.
Yeah, because I guess it could get sort of disempowering if you think that only one person is the source of all great wisdom and great ideas. It really comes from everybody.
Yeah.
Alex?
Yes, operating with genuine uncertainty and high risk as an entrepreneur are almost impossible for an entrepreneur in a conservative legacy company. Do you have any recommendations to break through the above?
Djordjija, I'm sure you have experience with this.
Well, now, there are two aspects of that. Without really support from the top, will be reasonably difficult if you want to push immediately a big things, a big change. Identifying that support at the top is also very important, and that's my personal experience from the World Bank. When at that time, the new president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfensohn, came, he understood the problem of changing the World Bank. the need of internal support. And when we created that space for him to understand that supporting young employees of the World Bank can play a very important role, that created a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs inside the World Bank to move really very fast. If that's not the case, I think at least two elements are very important. One is to go with the smaller steps, short-term wins, with a logic that they can build the visibility that there is a hidden business case for sustainability, and that the company has to really revisit the way how they see sustainability. And that's bring us to the concept of really how we make the business case for sustainability more visible, more acceptable by this small step that entrepreneurs can eventually take. And also, I hope that creating a broader sentiment in the society, not just inside the company, but the ecosystem around the organization, which will make it easier for the people inside the organization see the unavoidable necessity of dealing with these issues, and probably utilizing the COVID pandemic now to make that easier to happen. But it's tough, and to be very honest, sometimes you need a luck to make that happen. If it doesn't work first time, try again or try in another organization. That's what all is about.
I know we're nearing the end of our time, Alex. Is there one more question we can sneak in under the wire?
The last question that I have is just whether the recording will be made available, and we plan on getting it edited and put onto our YouTube channel sometime soon.
Okay, excellent. Djordjija, there was one question I'll try to sneak in under the wire. It's a broad question, so I'll try to consolidate it as best I can. Different generations, millennials, Gen Z, or the generations that follow Gen Z, how do you think their perception of environment is going to change quickly?
In answering that really quickly, first, our perception about the Generation Z and the one before that or after that is really mismanaged. And I think the kind of research, James, you and your colleague are doing on understanding the Generation Z is very important to go there. My personal experience at Wharton is that I give my students a legacy paper without going in details. And when I see what they want to see themselves as consequence or whatever of their life 30 years from now is absolutely different from the traditional social media narrative of who are these young people, what is their vision and what they want. So a more deeper research in that space I think is absolutely critical to get them become part of solving the problems than just letting them go to the street and expressing their frustration.
Okay, Jim?
Hey, thanks so much. It's been my great pleasure to host you both on this webinar. The Buffalo Center for Cultural Innovation really appreciate your support. I hope that the attendees enjoyed this very insightful presentation by James Forr and Dr. Petkoski. I really appreciate your time and insights. This will be available following the webinar as a downloadable file from YouTube. So we hope you'll share it and enjoy it. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.